professor at Hanyang University.
Why don't I just introduce it briefly?
Sure. Get in the shot.
Yeah. No, don't change it.
Okay.
아이고. 안녕하세요. 저희가 여기가 도만사라고 이제 하는 공간인데 뭐 여기 이제 다들 오셨으니까 이제 보셨을 거고 저희가 굉장히 작은 그냥 문화 공간, 엄청 작죠. 그러니까 뭐 문화 공간이라고 하기에는 굉장히 작은데 뭐 이런 거를 저희가 이제 오픈해서 운영하고 있습니다. 그래서 여기 보시면 이제 도시와 주거 관련된 책들도 있고 앞으로 여기서 이제 뭐 전시도 할 거고 이런 토크도 진행할 거고 하니까 많이 관심을 가져주시고 저희가 이거를 오피셜 오프닝은 다음 주 토요일에 이제 전시 오프닝을 하는데 그 전에 우리가 여기서 한 세 달 됐죠. 3달 전에 이 한국에 이제 있는 외국인 건축가 교수들 되게 어떻게 보면은 되게 스페시픽한 그룹이고 어떻게 보면 되게 그냥 베이그한 그룹인데 이렇게 그냥 캐주얼하게 모여가지고 얘기하던 참에 이제 외국인 교수라고 하는 게 이제 여기 서울에 왔을 때 이제 서울을 보고 아니면 여기의 건축을 보고 여기 문화를 보고 할 때 또 우리랑 좀 다른 시각들이 있을 테니까 그거를 한번 공유하는 자리를 가져보자 해가지고 매달 이렇게 진행이 되고 있습니다. 근데 이제 처음에 그래서 여기 수팔 크리스찬하고 송률 선생님께서 이제 그 스타트를 끊어주셨고 지난달엔 애니 페드렛이 이제 했는데 아무래도 이제 막 상황이 안 좋았었잖아요. 그래가지고 좀 온라인으로 많이 이제 대체하고 있는데 이제 오늘은 이제 오프라인하고 온라인으로 이제 진행할 거고 오늘은 이제 이 세 번째는 라파엘 루나라고 지금은 이제 한양대에 있습니다. 그래서 한양대 건축학부 교수고 지금 여기 바로 앞에 프라우드 설계사무소에서 저랑 같이 설계사무소를 운영하고 있는 라파엘입니다. 그래서 오늘 라파엘이 해줄 얘기는 의외로 서울에 관한 얘기예요. 그래서 서울 하면 우리가 마치 더 잘할 것 같지만 또 라파엘의 시각에서 이해한 어떤 서울을 한번 보는 자리가 됐으면 좋겠습니다. 네, 봐주셔서 감사하고 라파엘한테 한번 큰 박수.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll try to keep it brief, but we'll see. And the whole point of this lecture series at the beginning was to somewhat express as someone that is not Korean coming to Korea, how do you understand Korea, and more importantly, how do you understand Seoul? So this is one point of view that I have in the way of understanding Seoul that I'll present almost in the form of a research.
Maybe you can just.
Yeah.
Or did you want to see the YouTube?
No. Right. 1 second. So, okay. So, this is my point of view in a way of how you can understand Seoul. And the main intention is not just Seoul in general, but the Megalopolis, hence that's in the title, which is Seoul, the Infra-architectural Atoll, Typological Islands of the Megalopolis, right? And I'll just give you a quick background of the structure of this lecture, just an introduction, some historical anecdote, and then the analytical view of how I am understanding Seoul, right? So the point of this research, let's say, starts with this phrase by Pier Vittorio Aureli from a possibility of an absolute architecture, which is what sort of significant and critical relationship can architecture aspire to in a world that is no longer constituted by the idea and the motivation of the city, but is instead dominated by urbanization? It's a very long question, but in essence, it points out that there's a difference between the project of city and the project of urbanization. And then we usually use them interchangeably, but they actually mean very different things. And architecture actually has engaged the project of the city, but we haven't figured out a way of engaging as an architect the project of urbanization. So this is a question of how to deal with urbanization from the point of view of an architect. And this change of the project of cities to a project of urbanization was something that was also pointed out by Ludwig Hilberseimer in his book, The New City Principles of Planning, where he denoted this difference again between the city and urbanization, that as an effect that you could see in ancient cities up to the medieval city, where the city would have a specific form by two factors, one a geographical and the second by a man-made factor, both for the purpose of protection. The man-made one we know as walled cities, protected by the fortress that would give the city its distinct shape. But during the 1800s, sorry, not 80s, 1800s, there was a radical change. Actually, starting with the 1400s and the fall of Rome, there was a drastic change where the project of the city started failing. And by 1800s, the medieval city was no longer working, and there was a need for expansion due to new industrialization that brought people into the cities. So Ildefonso Cerda proposed this general theory of urbanization as a way of addressing how we can expand the city, de-densify the city centers, and just spread in a thin, dense manner, but in an infrastructural organization all the way to the suburbs. So going back to Hilberseimer in his own book, he denotes this as a drastic change, that it's no longer a city form, but now it's an infrastructural form, and city can be understood through the points of view of infrastructure. Architecture in this way is no longer present, as shown here in the project of Chicago. And this was further expanded by Constantino Doxiadis in his studies of echystics, with his book Ecumenopolis and the Inevitable City of the Future, where he proposed the idea that the city would just become one world city, or one city for the entire world. Right. Moving forward, recognizing this issue, Xavier de Gaither launched this research called After Sprawl, where he specifically looked at the Belgium and Netherlands region, showing these type of maps, which are not contested, are uncontested mappings that we can see from NASA satellites of the reality of how we have urbanized entire continents, entire countries, entire regions, where the project of the city is completely lost, and there's no longer city form. It's just these almost like ink blocks, right? And we cannot recognize what is what. So again, how do you deal with this as an architect? How do you propose organization? And they launch the idea of urban voids, almost as organizational islands through the void. And this expansion on the idea of understanding the megalopolis through islands was further enhanced by Pier Vittorio Lelli, which is the starting point of this research, where he theorizes this notion of architects working through islands, architecture as an island, where he describes projects by Mies van der Rohe, Hilberseimer, Palladio, Piranesi, Goulet, Koolhaas, and of course Ungers, that leads him to this theory of the absolute architecture, which I don't know if he says absolute form, but he says absolute architecture, but I can call it an absolute form, where he defines absoluteness as a cut, a definition, an absolute definition, a separation. So he defines absolute architecture as something that defines a boundary and separates itself from the rest of urbanity. And in that way, it produces a distinct form. And this, of course, all references at Ungers and the Berlin Green Archipelago, and trying to understand the city as a series of islands. The criticism here that I see is that all of these projects propose understanding the city through architectural islands, but then the islands work as autonomous objects. They don't work as a urbanization model. They work as a way of proposing some strategic point, region analysis and some form of organization, but not as an expansion model. At the same time, there's a parallel narrative that is pointed out by Stan Allen in Points and Lines, where he recognizes this notion that the project of the city is lost and infrastructure is the profession or dominating field that has taken over the role of making city. So in that case, as architects, if we take infrastructure as a toolbox for architects, then we could propose hybrids between infrastructure and architecture as a way to address urbanization. So this then could be studied as a theory of this infra-architectural hybrid, which if you go through all these urban theories and not focusing so much on urbanization theories, but just on these instances that people have talked about infrastructure and architecture being hybridized, you can go back to the ancient city and even the rites of Jove or Vitruvius, the Arquitectura, Noli Piranesi, but more importantly, it focuses on theories from the 1950s, where we started seeing the project of megastructure and proposed by Peter and Alison Smithson with the Golden Lane project 1952. Then the Situationists with Constance, the New Babylon, and of course the 60s in Japan with the Metabolists led by Tange. And you notice that I'm not showing the Tokyo Bay project, but I'm showing the Mecca project, which I find more interesting because it's on land, so we can relate to it more as a project that's more realistic. And the structuralists with Joseph Candiles and Woods, which were able to achieve some of the projects. These theories being brought to America. We see Paul Rudolph and the proposal for Lomex, the Lower Manhattan Expressway. And culminating again with Stan Allen with infrastructural urbanism, and that leads Charles Waldheim and James Corner to develop landscape urbanism that's seen in projects like the Seattle Olympic Sculpture Park by Weiss-Manfredi. The criticism here on this side, if we're not looking at the island, but we're looking at the infrastructural urbanism, the ones that got built as proposed by Kenneth Frampton, they became islands unto themselves. So projects like Seun Sanga in Seoul, the Brunswick in London, the projects that were built, they were never urban models. They got built as a building and just covered one block and became obstructions in the city. So they became islands unto themselves. This is a very, I would say, Western-centric criticism that was, so again, this idea of the megastructure becoming an island to itself is a criticism by Kenneth Frampton, which I see is a very Western-centric criticism. Because then we have research by, for example, Jonathan Solomon, Cities Without a Ground, a Hong Kong guidebook, that he starts noting that in Asian cities, we could understand the project of the megastructure through all of these infrastructural pedestrian connections that connect buildings, infrastructure, and the city at different levels. So maybe there's a potential that the infrastructure as an urbanization model is happening in Asian cities. So it might be worth to revisit all of these ideas of the megastructure. Where do you find, or where can you analyze that? Of course, Jonathan Solomon already researched Hong Kong. Coming to Seoul, I see this as the perfect testing ground for understanding the mega city. One, because it is a mega city, we understand the metropolitan region as a 20 million people city. But more interestingly enough is that it develops so fast that we can actually trace all of these layers, historical layers of changes, that we can see examples of all of these historical theoretical traits depending on the government period of Seoul. So it gives like a perfect testing ground to see all these island effects and megastructural effects. This is a photography triptych. I only have 2 images, so it's diptych, but the triptych by An Sekwon actually shows how this rapid transformation in Seoul always revealed that the remaining factor was the infrastructure, not the architecture. So if we start understanding these architectural islands as infra-architecture as well, we could also trace these as remainders. So I'm just going to take you through 10 typological islands that I see happening in Seoul. And the proposal is that if we were to review all these megastructural theories of the 1950s, and again, like the Kensotange Mecha project, it required a megastructure network to produce the urbanization model, and it required a plugin, an architectural plugin that you would put as a unit. My theory or my proposal is that if we were to look at it at the mega city scale and not in the scale that they were proposed, like Golden Lane was proposed for a city of 30,000 people, which doesn't make sense, right? But if we look at it in the sense of 20 million people, we have the megastructural composition, which I'll explain in the next part, but we need the plugin. And the plugin, I'm proposing that it's not architectural pieces, but these typological islands that we can theorize that the architectural typological islands are the plugins for the megastructure. So some of the ones that we can see in Seoul are the political form or the political form island. These we can understand as the not forms that enclose government facilities, but they're political, just as Pier Vittorio Aureli was saying of absoluteness. They enclose the ground, so they're political because they have control of a specific region of the ground. So if we just look at this through mappings, old mappings of the Chosun dynasty, we can see, for example, the map of the world, how the form of the city was defined by the fortress. And even though in the Rites of Sho, they explained that the city should be a square because of geographical conditions, the city was laid in between the 4 mountains. I don't need to explain this to all of you guys, but just from the architectural point of view, we can see that the form of the city was the form of the fortress, right? But more importantly, are the typological islands that it forms. So it's not the fortress itself that I'm interested in. It's more of these architectural conditions that happen because of the royal grounds, right? So the royal grounds would always be enclosed in certain parts of the city. And whenever there was a new king, that a new palace was built, they would follow the same model. And the previous palace was always kept, and it would always remain as part of the symbolic structure of the city. So this we see through all the maps throughout the different centuries, that the political form of the palaces always remained. And you can see that that's the only important part that was always represented in these maps. There's never even a representation of urban fabric, the generic fabric. It's just the political forms, right? And the political forms, even within themselves, they have their own logic that it almost mimicked the structuralist logics that were theorized by Joseph Canullas and Woods, that just by the repetition of a module, they could form their own image, almost their own urban fabric within the form itself. And this was put against the background of the generic fabric, which we know as the hanoks, which were never depicted in a map. They were always depicted through aerial paintings, which in the paintings, we can always see the political form being separated. So this is the political form separated from the generic fabric, even in the paintings themselves, right? I'll try to skip through a lot of the politics that happened, but the next one was the iconic form, which actually appeared during the Dehan Empire. I'm not going to explain the Dehan Empire, but when King Gocheon became the king, I was more fascinated by the story of the lady behind the man, Queen Min, who actually was able to produce a lot of the politics that were happening in Seoul. And in the fear of getting invaded by Japan, which they had already tried, by advisory of the Chinese consul, she started forming treaties with a lot of the Western nations. So that's when we start seeing these alliances with the United States in '82, Germany, UK, Russia, Italy, France, Austria. And what she allowed them to do was to build their legation, you can say like an embassy type, right? And each legation would bring their Western style of architecture in a singular building that would clear an area of the city. In this case, it was around Toksugun Palace. but it would stand with against the grain of this generic fabric that we would see. Skipping through a lot of the politics, when King Kojong came back after Japanese rebellion that almost tried to take over Korea, that they had already imposed some reforms in '94, and after the assassination of Queen Min, when King Kojong comes back and forms the Daehan Empire in '67, he reinstates these Gwangmu reforms, trying to modernize the city, following the lead of Queen Min that had already instated all of these international legations to come in and bring international technologies. So you start seeing infrastructural changes that actually start demarcating the iconic form as an area, as a field. So this is a mapping of all of these foreign legations that would actually be getting closed by the first electrical grid of Seoul. And that became almost an island unto itself. So that was the hot spot during that time. That's like the Hongdae, right? That's where you would go clubbing. Or Itaewon, right?
So where's the hot spots, the electric?
It's on the map, but I cleared out the map in there so you could see it. So the red line is the first electrical line in Seoul, which enclosed Cheongdong, and that was where all the international legations happened. So it became its own island, its own containment. But when the Japanese finally took over in 1910, it's theorized by Todd Henry, who wrote this book called Assimilating Seoul, that the Japanese actually used architecture as an assimilation tool to force the Japanese culture onto Korea, right? So in this case, we start seeing architecture being used to impose itself on anything that had to do with the Chosun structure. Here we see, for example, the Bank of Chosun, Mitsukoshi, and the Keiju Post Office, which actually formed almost the first plaza, you could say, in a Western style almost. And obviously, they started throwing off anything that had to do with the power of Chosun. So King Kojong had declared Doksugun as the main palace. So they make that into a park, and they put a city hall right in front of it. And in front of the city hall, we see the new clearing that starts forming a more formal plaza with new grids that lead to the next plaza, also covered by Japanese buildings. And of course, everybody knows the most imposing one, the Government General Building. And I love this photo from inside the palace, so you can't see anything. But from the other side, that was the intention to cover the main emblem of the Chosun. Right. So when we see the map of 1933, by then you can start seeing how the architecture has made clearings and form their own specific islands like voids, almost as how Xavier de Gator was explaining, right? So some are not Japanese, like the Myeongdong Cathedral, but it was left as its own void. We see the Mitsukoshi Bank and the post office forming their clearings over there. Everything almost hinting as the best part being in the south, which was where the Japanese were using as their residential neighborhood, right? And more importantly, this is when the project of the city in Seoul changed, right? So the Japanese completely, not demolished completely, but they started demolishing the image of the city by demolishing parts of the wall, putting all these impositions of the new buildings, and proposing the grid, right? This was the idea that Ildo Fonseca of having the grid as the expansion network. So this is the first time that they started imposing an actual grid, which was based on the radial city model. But after their first planning, which we can see in all the maps of 1936 and 38, this became almost a Western style of urbanization through the grid, expanding south to Yeongdong-po. And it's the first time that we see the image of the city not as a project of the city in the architectural sense of having a direct form, but more in the abstract way of having which is just a made-up boundary, right? It has no formal presence. So this is the first time that we see the break of the project of the city. Sorry, I'll speed up. But the third island, which I bet everybody knows this one, right? But it's the apartment blocks. And this comes after the Japanese and after the the Korean War in 1953. And there was a period of unrest, economic and political unrest. That 1961, there's the military coup, and in 1963, Chung-hee Park becomes the first, can I say dictator in? Okay.
Yeah.
The first dictator.
First or
Okay. Well, government, if you're watching. Right. So one of the interesting things is that he was actually a junior official in the military of Japan. So he was still doctrinated with a lot of the Japanese models. One of them, which was the government having control of the economy. Of course, the other one, other stuff, but that was the main one. So he was able to change the economic model to an export-oriented model, which produced a GDP growth of like 8% for the next 3 decades. What this demanded was an influx of population coming into the city of Seoul. So it demanded a new housing model. The Korean Housing Corporation is formed in 1962, and they launched the first apartment pilot in the Mapo apartments. So the idea here was to look at land readjustment models where they could take a lot of the plots and group them together as one giant plot of land that could be developed by one single entity. In this case, the Korean National Housing Corporation, where we see, for example, in the Mapo apartments, the reparcelization. So the top one is 1962, the bottom one is 2020. Where the parcelization has remained and all that it changes is the apartment density. But it always remains, again, in the separating itself from the urban sea of the generic fabric. This, of course, gets repeated throughout all of Seoul as Seoul starts expanding to the south, and all through land readjustment models. So they use the same model of parcelization, taking many plots and making them into one big plot so that it could be rapidly developed, leading to what we have today, right? In green, if you can see, these are all the apartment blocks. And even though you just see it as green blotches, when you zoom in, you see the distinct definition of each apartment development, which I'm sure all of you know. One of the other things that happened during this time is that they couldn't do land readjustments in the downtown area because there were so many little plots that they couldn't buy them all out. So they had to rely on using government-owned land. One of them being this leftover land from 1937 from the Air Defense Act from the Japanese that left a strip of almost a kilometer long, 50-meter wide as a firebreaker, which we all know as Seung-sanga, right? So this was a piece of land that the government already owned that they could take. So Park Chung-hee, known as the bulldozer mayor, contacted the first, we can say, star architect, the first generation of star architects in Korea, Kim Soo-gun, to propose something for this site. Kim Soo-gun, coming from Tokyo University, graduating in 1958, studying with Kenzo Tange, had some of these ideas of the metabolist, and of course, again, all of you already know better than me, proposes this mega structure to provide like a three-dimensional city, right? So it's a kilometer-long structure, 50-meter wide, but I'm actually showing this aerial from 1972, where we see Nakwon as well. This is another piece of land that the government owned because it's on top of the street. So the idea that they could only use government-owned land left only streets to be used. Of course, Yoido was also master planned as a mega structure, but that was not realized. So there's a period of these ideas of the Sangha apartments, the mixed use. All of these are the Sangha apartments that got built. 3 of them got built as mega structures. Seun Sangha, Nakwon, and Eugene Sangha, that use the streets to hybridize into building. And as theorized by Kenneth Frampton, as said that the megastructure ended up being an island unto itself, not connecting to the rest of the network. 5th, the super block with the expansion of Gangnam. Again, the need to produce more development and more housing. The plan of 1966, it's, even though diagrammatic, it was brought almost as the master plan itself. So the grid that was implemented in the plan of 1966 was barely touched, and it was only modified due to topographical issues, which led to creating these blocks that are almost 800 by 800 meter blocks, right? Separated by 50-meter wide boulevards. And the idea was that this would allow for fast development, because you could just give this huge piece of land to one developer, just like the land readjustment, or let private developers develop inside the block and try to produce a village type of quality. So this is one of those that was left to private development, and it did produce that unique fabric inside of the mega fabric. Also, because of zoning and FAR and zoning codes, the perimeter of the block was zoned with a higher FAR and mixed-use zoning, while the interior of the blocks were more housing. So it ended up resulting in these kind of village neighborhood unit type of quality, which the neighborhood unit was also proposed. So each of these blocks had to have a school, and it became its own little village. Again, a containment of city within the city. 6-1, Seoul gets Seoul gets assigned the 1986 Asian Games and the 1988 Olympics. This completely shifts the way that they want to present Seoul to the world. This is the global stage. It's no longer about just self-industrialization and growing the GDP. Now it's the image of the city. So one of the best ways to show that you're a modern city and full of money is through corporate towers. The idea was to redevelop the downtown, which again was left untouched, and they had a hard time doing these land readjustments. So for the first time, the eminent domain went to the to the private sector, to these corporate companies. And they tried out for the first time something that's called stereo replotting, which was taking a lot of horizontal plots of land, or parcels or plots, and assigning them vertical value. So the horizontal plotting became vertical plotting. This became an easier model for, to give all of these smaller plots to a corporate company, and they could develop just their headquarters. They didn't have to clear the entire block. They just had to clear a certain area that would fit a tower. And this started forming islands of corporate towers in the middle of downtown that we all know. At the same time, that image of the global city, we see, the commercial value of the city, right? So we start seeing projects like COEX, and of course, Lotte and Hyundai developing their mega malls as well, Lotte World, where we see them as just one building as an entire block, which mimics all of these theories of bigness by Rem Koolhaas, of just a giant shell with the city within the city and just inside the shell. When we look at these projects like the Lotte World, they actually do have housing, commercial, hotels, everything that you can think of, all in one, one mega architecture, if you can say that. Then after the World Cup 2002, there's a new vision of the city. There's the idea of bringing the cultural capital model from Europe, which had been established in 1995, and using that as the new model for the city. This meant that we should look back at all the heritage that's still left untouched, one of them being Hanoks, right? So Bukchon became a heritage block. Almost what used to be the generic fabric is now enclaves of heritage, right? We see the same in Ixondong and other of these enclaves. And then the model of changing the monoculture apartment blocks for something that was more diverse. We start seeing private developments of podiums, the podium typology, which also mimics almost a city of the captive globe of forming a podium as the generic urban fabric, and then we can put any piece of architecture on top. And this is what you could find in Seoul, entire blocks that are just one podium of its own architecture and a different architecture of usually apartment buildings on top. This one, for those coming from Hanyang, you might recognize the Sharp building, right?
That's where the corona.
That's where the corona started.
No, there was actually phases from there.
Oh. And lastly, the infra-architectural island. This one was interesting, coming out of the 1970s and 80s, 1974 being the first subterranean line. But even coming from the 60s, where the city started building for military purposes, all these underpasses. And quickly they started becoming underground architecture that started connecting buildings around them. So this, for example, is in Dongdaemun, where we could see now the connection between the Dongdaemun History Plaza and Milyori and Lotte Fitin, right? Almost forming an underground podium for above buildings. So we can look at these typologies as islands that could serve as plugins to a mega structural network. And you can analyze them as case studies. Because they are typological islands, it's something that if you study one island and the effects of one island, you could probably guess what would happen if the same typological island happens in another part of Seoul. So for example, this is Hongdae, and if we analyze just one block of Hongdae and seeing, in this case, appropriations that happen in between buildings, these micro shops that happen in 1 meter between buildings, chances are if we see the same typology as an island somewhere else in Seoul, we'll see the same type of appropriations, which is what happens in Shinsa, which follows the same typological model. So in that case, we can conclude that you can understand Seoul not through infrastructure, but through architectural islands. And mimicking a potato plan of Abercrombie for London, where he would do islands of social conditions, we can do a potato plan of islands of typological islands, sorry. So you can understand Seoul through these typologies. And again, understanding what happens in one typology, you can guess what would happen in somewhere else. So those could serve as plugins for a network that's already starting to evolve in Seoul. Again, coming from the 1970s underground system that quickly started expanding as underground architecture, connecting to the subway system. If we analyze the subway system as this potential for building up these underground networks, this is a map that shows this 600-meter radius connections from each station in Seoul. We can see that it actually covers almost the entirety of all of the built overground built area of Seoul. So instead of analyzing them as pieces of architecture, which they're underground pieces of collective architecture, we can analyze them as nodes. Who's here? Oh yeah. Actually, Chongwon is helping this analysis, where we can see how to analyze these nodes through efficiency models that can easily give an optimization model of ranking. It gives you a model of how to understand these nodes and how they're failing or how they're being efficient or inefficient, and how you can optimize them through making the station as a connection to the rest of the block of the typological islands. Right. So one case study that, again, all of you probably know is the growth of the Uljiro network. That it started as this 3.3 kilometer long underground pass, but over the years, we see more connections into the surrounding buildings, becoming this mega structure that starts plugging into any new development that sits near any of these node conditions. So any new development that gets built, for example, the D block all the way to Jongak Station, all of those new corporate headquarters connect to the underground network and becomes part of this mega structure underground. So it gives a reference that this is something that could happen, and it's already happening in the three main nucleuses of Seoul: Yeongdeungpo, Gangnam, and the downtown Ujiro. Right. So if you haven't walked the 3.3 kilometers, you should. Right. So the conclusion there is again that we do have this system of almost an underground mega structure, that it is spreading through the subway system and the typological islands that are already there, that are already plugging into this underground system. So it actually mimics all of these ideas that Ken Sotange had of Mecca, for example, of having this mega structure and architecture plugging in. But my criticism is that maybe the scale was wrong, right? Maybe we were looking at architecture that should only happen in the megalopolis, not in the city, right? And again, city being different than metropolis, megalopolis, and the metropolitan condition, right? That's it. Thank you.
Can we see the screen?
The what?
Oh, it's done. All right. They want to see the screen on your face.
Ah. Okay, so any questions from the audience or from the people watching online?
혹시 질문 있나요? 질문. Questions.
Very basic. What I, with my lack of knowledge. So what's the difference between megalopolis and metropolis?
Metropolis is a concept that comes from the 1900s. We could even say it coming from the metropole in Paris, the underground, the metro, right? But it's a 1900 concept of something that's growing beyond the city, which
So
was all.
the metro means the subway.
Metro is reference to the Paris subway,
Oh, okay.
which allowed for the expansion of the city, just how in the subway of Seoul, the subway is expanding the city. But again, it is a 1900s concept that we see in movies like Metropolis from Fritz Lang, 1927 movie, right? With this idea of all the skyscrapers and airplanes flying through the city and multi-level city.
But also the huge underground.
In the huge underground, but they were referencing cities that were like 1 million people, right? So the architecture that, for me, the architecture that happens at a city of 1 million people is different than the architecture that happens at a city of 20 million people. So hence the megalopolis comes also from these studies of the ecumenopolis from Constantino Doxiadis, that he hypothesized the city becoming, or sorry, the world becoming one city, right? Becoming these mega cities that move beyond the idea of the metropolis. And the metropolis also had a sense of still being associated as a city, that it was still the center of commerce, center of education, culture, everything like that, political center. While the megalopolis, if it is a connection of everything, then it's decentralized.
Then your proposal on your conclusion, is it, from my assumption, that it's more about the megalopolis as a vision for the Seoul.
Right. Seoul is a 20 million people city that even if you drive 2 hours outside of Seoul, you'll still find the same development of high density apartment buildings connected to a train station.
Yes.
And it'll probably be functional. It'll probably get used.
I mean, maybe like this is something like Seoul was for me my first Asian city. You know, when I arrived here, it was a shock to me, and in the very beginning, I hated the city.
What? Let's put the camera on you. Who's saying?
In the sense that I maybe because I wasn't able to understand it or to find my place in it, but over the time it turned out to be actually a very efficient city to live in, so to say. Like it's actually very convenient to live in this sprawl or network or whatever you can call it, like from this megalopolis in contrast to the decentralized city in Europe, like the city that spread into the decentralized city. And here we have really the network. But then at some points it's extremely exhausting, but extremely efficient. And I have these phases now where I love Seoul, and then I go into the slums where I hate Seoul, which for me always raises the question of identity. That I live in my small sub-city. I live around this 600-meter radius around a subway station that has all the necessary infrastructure. So I don't know how many people, maybe 200,000 people. I don't know how many people live, so to say, in a sub-center. But all what you said were kind of analytic terms, you know, and in all these theories that were made on city, that look basically from above, like the modernist architect looks from above. Is there a model also to describe Seoul actually from eyesight, like from the personal experience? Because like with my students, I think by now 64% of the Seoul population lives in these apartment islands, you know. And they move around always from one apartment to the other. Right. So I had students that really moved within their 18 years like from birth to high school, moved like 6, 7, 8 times. So you are always disconnected from what we in Europe would call home, and these are terms that in this lecture, in this analytic lecture, they are not there. But are there models to describe what actually I meanwhile find boring in Europe, that I miss sometimes, but once you experience Seoul, you start to question whether we need it, but whether there's a model to replace, so to say, or to find identity in the city on the eyesight, like on the human scale, and not on the top-down analytic scale, so to say.
But I think understanding it through the typological islands is the human scale, because it is that micro village.
It's IKEA, that's why. Sorry about that.
Sorry, we had. Okay. I think that for me, trying to understand it as a typological island eliminates the idea of the top-down view as a master plan, because it is almost sporadic. And by understanding the typology that happens there, you're understanding it through architecture. You're not understanding it through a master plan or infrastructure or anything like that. You're understanding it through, if you go to a Hanok village, you expect to see that architecture and then that condition, at the eye level that you're saying. So,
but the Hanok village is an exception. No? Basically, all these 600 islands, or how many stations we have, they all form the same generic island.
No, but
it becomes exchangeable, where it doesn't matter whether I live at this subway station or at the other subway station. It's again a generalification term in that sense. So I'm not sure whether we whether we still need it, but I'm asking this because of my mood swings and so on. In Europe, I always have the same mood kind of, but here I have these extreme mood swings between love and hate, which means that there is something missing in that sense, or maybe this is actually good. While in Europe, like I come from a town of 50,000 inhabitants. You know? Like right now in my little island of a subway station, I live in a bigger city than I come from. But there I always feel the same. But so here it's actually more exciting. You know? It goes up and down. But I feel that something is missing here that nobody really could explain to me yet, and even I myself cannot explain to me, and I don't know where to grip into it.
I think, in my personal opinion, I'm not sure whether there's any alternative model that could replace this type of a complex apartment compound model when we are talking about like whatever. I don't know what was the population in the 1950s, but I'm sure that it's like whatever several times more than now. It's more than
900,000.
Right?
No, it was 900,000, and
So
then
yeah,
it jumped to 1.2 million, and then 2 million, and then 5 million.
so it's more than 10 times then, right? So I don't know whether there's. I mean, I also have the sort of kind of like some sort of architect's aesthetic that we should love this type of more permeable fabric with low but high density but low rise housings. But I think that I think from now on probably there are some alternatives that can come into play, because now we're not expecting any kind of major population growth. I think the issue though is that actually happened to myself as well. That when I was coming back to Korea from the States, I really didn't want to live in an apartment complex. So I was looking at all these like small neighborhoods, whatever, and then I think about, okay, what about now I have baby. Back then I didn't, but what if I have a baby? Okay, can I bring my dog out or whatever? Those kind of, let's say, I'll say calculation, kind of led me to have a same conclusion, right? So I think that's the issue. That, I mean, you're saying that 65% are living in the apartment, but then that means that still 35% or 40% are still living in those let's say low-rise dense neighborhood.
Like the second largest, I think 30% lives in this multifamily, like North Nowongu, like endless fields of these 5-story elevated with car parking. They are exactly.
Yeah, the villa
they are
type.
actually as generic as the apartment.
Yeah,
but what I was saying is that, but when we encounter people, especially in the universities, I think that percentage of living in an apartment complex is way higher than the general ratio, because I think that the apartment complex has become the type for family. So people rather raise their kids in those complexes. So even though, let's say, I don't know the percentage, whether, let's say, the apartment complex is 60% and rest whatever 40%, but then the people that we actually see will be much higher who are living in the apartment complex, because in general we don't really interact with, let's say, some seniors who are living separately or who are living independent. Right, so that I think that social gap is also quite a crucial thing. But anyways, so I actually had a question. I was gonna ask a question, but is there a question?
Oh yeah, no, Sarah knows all the details on how many people live in apartments. She's helping out with the apartment research.
So
just a quick note on that one, on this type. It actually comes from this. This is the distribution of factories by the Japanese that actually led to them developing like 400 apartment buildings for factory workers, which were the villa type. And then that also got adopted in the 1960s when actually in Seongsu for factory workers as well. So the villa type became associated with that as well. So I think there's that stigma of family housing is apartments. Other type of worker is here. Another type of, it was almost like by demographics. And I think it has that stigma.
I think I think this is super interesting talk and presentation that touches a lot of questions that many people may have when you're living in Seoul, and also it touches the history. So I think it's really great. I think one of the reasons why all these, let's say, archipelago type of development happens so dramatically in Seoul is because I think our kind of, let's say, the modernization of the city wasn't so well applied. When I say modernization of the city, it means it's basically parcelization. That basically, okay, how do we get rid of the old parcels and then adopt a new kind of parcels that can be like commissions plan in New York. That how do we sell it? How does the government sell it in a same price, whatever? You know,
people see the faces.
So I think then realized that even during the Japanese colonial era, when we had a chance to really apply, let's say, modern parcelization, which they did some, but in your talk, it's also interesting that how they kind of like had their own sort of island as part of the development strategy. So I think it feels like it's almost like a destiny of Seoul that we cannot get rid of this type of archipelago development. But I think my question will be then what do you think of the role of infrastructure? When I say infrastructure, this one probably is mostly either subway or the transportation system. What do you think the infrastructure, the role of the infrastructure in terms of those archipelago development? Because it feels like that's almost kind of let's say poking more of those archipelago developments rather than something like what Christian was saying, that should we now not think about this type of large development, but think about smaller. But
this is not what I'm saying. I'm asking for the identity, but also can bring into apartments a distinct identity, like this human identity. This is what I mean from eyesight, so to say. Not smaller things, but how we can relate to a city. And I mean, Seoul now is trying this. They have these programs of making the city more livable, with bike lanes and whatnot. But it all doesn't touch this question of the larger infrastructure.
No, but going back to that question, and in that shift of the 2002 becoming the global capital, and actually in 2012 there was an addition to that goal or that aim of becoming I don't want to say borrowed city, the shared city. So adding to the to the cultural capital, in 2012, the mayor passed an agenda of becoming a shared city, which in the definition it says something of a city that touches upon the fourth industrial revolution and the shared economy. And we start seeing more of these projects of turning infrastructure into collective spaces. Solo was built in 2017, right? 2017. already in 2002 to 2006, we had seen the transformation of Seoul Plaza, which was infrastructural space, now as a collective space, Seoul Forest. And then again, with this new agenda, we continue seeing those things, but adding to the idea of the fourth industrial revolution and technologies that allow us to pinpoint and all that stuff, we start seeing optimization of infrastructure in the way that architects can engage small programs and small little interventions into that huge infrastructural space that makes it more of that, what you're saying, the high level architecture. So even in here, like in Seongsu Station and Tukson Station, that it's supposed to be about the shoe industry, we start seeing the little pavilions, right, that are there to promote the culture of shoe industry on the sidewalk, inside the station as a shoe museum, which otherwise would have just left as subway station, right? There's no need to put a museum in there. So I think, and in the role of, or the next role that I keep on seeing of infrastructure is that the network is already there. They're not building new mega highways, like Kambyang Expressway is there, right? They're not going to make a new one. The subway, what's happening is extensions rather than, I mean, there are new line proposals, but it's almost like more connections, more extensions, and every time there's a new underground infrastructural project, it's now becoming an architectural project, that it's not just about the node, it's about the underground space that connects to a building above, and then how you can make that a collective space. So I think the humanization of infrastructure is what's happening, I would say, or the optimization of infrastructure as an architectural space that humans can use.
I mean, there's relating to your question, that there's another aspect in Seoul, that the differentiation between infrastructure and what is the other thing, like infrastructure and architecture, like that Seoul, really everything is infrastructure. Like the apartment block is infrastructure. Like basically, there is no other than infrastructure in Seoul, and this is also something that I still kind of wrap my head around. Like that everything is just infrastructure. So there is actually the complete elimination of architecture in itself. You know? Where then we don't need architects anymore in Seoul. We only need infrastructuralists in that sense.
Right.
You know? So one cannot distinguish that there is no other than infrastructure here. You know?
But you distinguish the architecture and infrastructure, no?
Yeah, but I'm saying infra-architecture. That's why I'm saying the rise of the infra-architecture, because it's the architect trying to intervene in the infrastructure, which, as you're saying, it's what created all of Seoul, or what we see as the majority of the environment is infrastructural environment, and we're trying to make it more architectural, more livable, more.
Whereas the question, do we actually need this anymore? Like this is an old notion that maybe comes from us from Europe with context and whatnot, or Peter Smithson's identity and association. I think it never really worked in Seoul.
I think Fabrizio misunderstood your comment about the Japanese villa typology. You're more talking about this low-rise.
Well, it was like 5-story workers' apartment.
Right. Yeah. I was wondering whether he's thinking.
But what is then the smart city if not the utopian for
the one above?
질문 있나요? 질문.
We're all pausing to read Fabrizio's.
은영 씨.
Yeah.
Thanks to highly technology and the complex network, these days the production of metropoles are getting more bigger and bigger, I guess. And so, like some people even commute from certain cities. So I was wondering, and that the metropoles gets more bigger and bigger, is there do we can call it metropolis. So, I mean,
We call it megalopolis.
do you think there is a limitation of metropolis?
So you're saying why call it megalopolis? Because you can still call it metropolis. Is there a distinction of one to the other? Can you still use the metropolis?
I mean, if the city gets too big, is it
Like,
still
is the
relevant?
next step of mega, like, is
What's
there
the limitation for the megalopolis? That's what we wanna-
ultrapolis.
So what's the limit? So now the Seoul is connecting to even smaller city, then even if they get bigger, so what's the limit for that? That's what.
The ecumenopolis. So
Like
yeah. I mean, so that's in 2012 we were talking about this. That are there different levels of that word metropolis that we even categorize the mini metropolis, that like cities like Boston we cannot compare to a city that we would reference as a metropolis back then, New York, right? And then if you expand the metropolis, then do we use words like the megalopolis by Doxiadis or the ecumenopolis? And then there's no, not that I know of, I don't know any demarcation of, why not just keep on calling it metropolis, but we just, I guess in my opinion, there should be a distinction between a city that's 600,000, a million, 200,000, 20 million people. Like we cannot compare Boston to Seoul in just its physical space, population. Yeah, they're different. But then we see books again like the 101 Metropolitan Atlas that calls them all metropolises.
How did Koolhaas call the like Netherlands, Belgium, Western Germany now formed, or was it MBRDV that did this analysis of this, like now cities spread across nation borders and form actually
The blue banana.
No,
he had a name, or was Koolhaas a name for this?
I mean, Xavier de Gater, who worked at OMA, maybe that's the one that you're thinking about because he came out of OMA, is the one that was doing this research of the sprawling city in the Netherlands and in Belgium. But I don't know if he used a different city, a different name. They were just using metropolitan regions.
But going back to Eunyoung's question, that I think already in economies or economics, they already do not measure the scale of the economy per city. I think they. I remember reading an article about the world economy or the powerful cities, whatever. But so basically, Seoul was one of them, one of top 10, whatever. But it's not so. It was actually Seoul to
Incheon,
Boston, to Busan, and then even Tokyo was Tokyo to somewhere, and
to Fukuoka.
Yeah, New York was not New York. New York was Boston to Washington or something. So I feel, I mean, it seems not feel, but it seems there are already kind of not architectural definition, but
economic.
Yeah, economic definition that it goes way beyond the Megalopolis that we are talking about. I think.
I think to try to keep it within the field of architecture, it would be difficult to distinguish, I would say, but that's why you see it in fields like economics and more politics, that they need an administrative boundary to give the role to the mayor. You control this much, right? But it's not based on physical structure, so it just becomes abstract geopolitical boundaries, and I don't know if there is a distinction, physical distinction, but there's a feeling.
Yes, it's recently discussion with in Peter Eisenman in the
It's still alive.
yes. And he said it doesn't matter how many people live there, and then every city nowadays is wanted to develop the megalo city. It doesn't matter 100 million, 200 million. Therefore, this not the city developed megalo city because of so many people, but at first the city itself made for these people, for future people. Therefore, there's no really definition of the how can I say, what is the forest, the people or city form. And then I also, this is analysis of the Korea, but I'm very also curious with her. So Seoul Korea is so focused in the Seoul, but there must be boundary. Yeah, there must be exist boundary, and then outside of Seoul, Daejeon, Masan, Changwon, everything is completely dead, and then looks so same. And then what's the mean if Seoul means megalo cities? This is some
Megalomania.
people the same, but and then just the Seoul lived in them survival, or and then when we are workshop, and then we have some Suncheon, then we saw some commercial film on this city. This is a so dead city, but it's their advertisement film was showing
City self advertisement movies, like every city.
So,
and really every small city portrays itself as a second Seoul, as a second mega city, even although they are insignificant and small. Like basically every city tries to copy the image of Seoul. So to say, although they don't have the expansion, but in their heads of the mayors and the politicians and even the people that live there, their small city becomes also ideologically a megalopolis.
There is no more. In the future, there's no more locality or some is like the Peter Smith. So Peter Smith and Smith, they said always that the city for people is not just architecture, but it's a pavement and the wall, street, and then this is the city for the people. It's not whole from the airplane. And then there is what is the really then city for the people. Then we said also infrastructure, their subway. But nowadays there's a motorbike, and then these cars on this street is a whole also infrastructure. It's actually is against or noise for the living for the people. Therefore, so I'm so.
So what will happen when Elon Musk finalizes the Hyperloop and Ulsan to Seoul will be 35 minutes? Then does it even matter if you live in the city or not? It will just be one city. Maybe.
I mean, which is already happening with the KTX.
Yeah. From Busan to Seoul. Or
the reason why all these small cities are dying is because they just come to Seoul for shopping.
Yeah.
Or they just whatever. So. 또 질문 있나요?
How about in the open to discussion? How about in the post-corona era, where everybody stays at home and it doesn't really matter if you're in Seoul or not? So that's forcing the decentralization. And then if it forces more people to separate, maybe these small cities will have a chance.
What chance?
I don't know.
질문 있나요? 질문? 질문이 없으시면 뭐. Sarah. Who's Sarah?
She's doing the research on the apartments, and Chongwon's doing the research on the nodes. So they should.
Okay, 뭐 질문이 없으면.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.